Joshua was relieved as he drove down the winding, dusty road leading to the Twisted Pines Festival. He and his friends have been talking about this weekend for months. A chance to let loose, listen to good music, and leave behind the stress of everyday life. The festival was known for its vintage country vibes, eccentric local bands, and that magical sense of freedom that only came from 3 full days off the grid. As they turned a corner and saw the campground sprawled before them, Joshua felt a wave of excitement and nostalgia. He had been to many festivals, but something about Twisted Pines felt special, as if he was stepping into a time capsule of country music's golden era. The sprawling field was lined with tents and makeshift campsites. The sky above stretched out wide and cloudless. It seemed almost surreal, a festival hidden so deep in the forest it felt as if it existed in a world of its own. Joshua and his friends parked the car and stepped out, greeted by the sounds of tuning guitars and laughter from other festival goers already setting up their tents. Around them, banners flapped in the warm breeze, each painted with the names of past headliners and festival dates. A huge wooden stage stood at the heart of the grounds, almost like a shrine to music itself, weathered by years of songs and celebrations. The 4 friends, Joshua, Mark, Linda, and Rachel, set up their tent and laid out their gear, eager to explore. They made their way to the center of the festival, where food stalls, merchandise tents, and colorful booths dotted the open field. An older man in a wide-brimmed hat and suspenders handed out festival brochures, the edges yellowed as if they had been printed decades ago. Joshua noticed the paper felt rough, almost antique, with faded ink and images that seemed frozen in time. He tucked it in his pocket, feeling an odd chill despite the warmth of the day. As the sun began to set, the atmosphere transformed. Lights flickered on, stringed along trees and the perimeter of the grounds, casting a warm, golden glow across the festival. The music grew louder, more enticing, and crowds gathered near the stage, where a local band was performing a gritty, old-fashioned country ballad. Joshua found himself entranced, his foot tapping along to the beat. Yet there was something strange, a note in the song, a discordant pitch that almost seemed intentional. When he looked around, no one else seemed to notice. Their group meandered through the crowd, soaking in the energy. But as Joshua scanned the people around him, he started to notice faces that seemed odd. Some festival goers wore vintage clothing that looked as though it had come straight out of an old Western movie. Their expressions were cheerful, but somehow hollow, their eyes glassy and unfocused. Joshua shook it off, thinking they were probably die-hard festival fans, committed to the retro vibe. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The further they walked, the more he felt like a stranger among ghosts. Eventually, they reached the main stage, where a band with a lead singer in a black cowboy hat was crooning a somber melody. Joshua and his friends stood in the crowd, swaying to the haunting tune. The singer's voice was deep and gravelly, almost too perfect, like an old vinyl record playing on loop. Suddenly, the music stopped, and the singer turned his gaze directly at Joshua. Their eyes met for a split second, a chilling, unbroken stare, before the man turned away, continuing his performance as if nothing had happened. After the set ended, Joshua's group found themselves wandering back to their tent, but the festival grounds seemed different. The lights were dimmer, the air felt thick, and the laughter from nearby tents seemed distant, like echoes from another world. Mark and Rachel brushed it off as festival weirdness, but Linda looked at Joshua, a similar unease in her eyes. They didn't speak of it, but a mutual understanding passed between them, a subtle recognition that they were both sensing the same thing. That night, as they lay in their tent, Joshua couldn't sleep. He heard footsteps outside, soft and slow, as if someone was wandering just beyond their campsite. But every time he looked out, no one was there. He tried to tell himself it was just the excitement and exhaustion of the day playing tricks on him. Yet, an uneasy thought nagged at him. He had never been to a festival that felt so alive, yet so unsettlingly empty at the same time. The morning arrived, and Joshua dismissed the night's strange occurrences as a product of fatigue. But as they stepped out of the tent, He saw a woman nearby packing up her belongings, her eyes wide with a strange, vacant stare. She muttered something under her breath, words that Joshua couldn't make out, and then hurriedly left, barely glancing at anyone. Joshua turned to ask Mark if he had seen the same thing, but Mark was already absorbed in planning their day, oblivious to anything out of the ordinary. Throughout the day, they tried to enjoy the music and festivities, but the feeling of wrongness only grew. Joshua's gaze kept drifting back to the main stage, where, to his surprise, the same band was setting up again, preparing to play the same set. Confused, he checked the schedule, which clearly showed a different band slated for that slot. Yet, as the lead singer adjusted his microphone, Joshua's heart sank. The singer met his gaze again, that same unblinking stare from the night before. He tried to laugh it off, to convince himself he was overreacting, but he couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread deep within him. And as the band began their first song, Joshua felt a terrible certainty wash over him. They were not meant to leave this festival. Not easily, and perhaps not ever. The day passed slowly, weighed down by the strange aura that seemed to linger over Twisted Pines. Joshua and his friends tried to settle into the festivities, hoping to shake off the odd tension from the night before, but the unsettling feeling remained. Joshua couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong, as though the very air of the festival carried an undercurrent of dread. Just as he began to dismiss his discomfort as paranoia, a strange tune drifted across the festival grounds. A faint, haunting melody played on a fiddle, cutting through the din of conversation and music. Joshua's gaze followed the sound, and at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the last row of tents, he saw him. A lone figure, dressed in an old, faded duster and wide-brimmed hat, his head bowed as he drew his bow across the strings. The fiddler's stance was rigid, almost statuesque, as if he were part of the landscape itself. The tune he played was unlike any Joshua had heard before, raw, sorrowful, and filled with an eerie, piercing quality that made his skin prickle. Compelled by a strange curiosity, Joshua began walking toward the fiddler, his footsteps falling in rhythm with the music. The closer he got, the stronger the pull became, as though the notes were guiding him. When he was close enough to see the man's face, he noticed the fiddler's eyes were closed, his expression one of intense concentration. Joshua wanted to speak, to ask the fiddler who he was and why his music sounded so hauntingly familiar, but his voice seemed to stick in his throat. The song ended abruptly, leaving an unnerving silence. The fiddler lifted his gaze, and Joshua found himself staring into the man's eyes that seemed unnaturally old, holding a depth of sorrow and weariness that Joshua couldn't place. The fiddler gave him a slight nod, as if he'd been expecting Joshua, as if he knew him. "They never warn you about the festival's price, do they?" the fiddler said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. "What do you mean?" Joshua asked, his voice barely a whisper, unsure whether he truly wanted an answer. "Twisted Pines," the fiddler continued. "It doesn't take kindly to visitors who stray too close. You're here because it wanted you to be here." He paused, his gaze shifting to the festival grounds. The music, the lights, the laughter, they're all distractions. Keeps people from noticing the truth. His words sent a chill through Joshua, though he struggled to understand what the fiddler meant. Was this a cryptic warning, or just an eccentric act for the festival? Before Joshua could respond, the fiddler pressed his bow to the strings again, this time drawing out a slow, mournful tune that sounded more like a dirge. The melancholy notes wrapped around Joshua, thick and heavy, filling his mind with images he didn't recognize. Dark forests, faces blurred and fading, and strange symbols carved into trees. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the music seemed to weave into his consciousness, pulling him deeper. Abruptly, the fiddler stopped and turned away, leaving Joshua staring after him in stunned silence. Joshua watched as the figure walked toward the tree line, his form blurring and shifting in the shadows until he disappeared entirely. A sense of urgency welled up in Joshua's chest, a need to follow, to demand answers, but when he tried to move, his legs felt rooted to the ground. By the time he shook himself free of the music's grip, the fiddler was gone. Back at the campsite, his friends were chatting, completely unaware of the strange encounter Joshua had just experienced. He sat down beside them, hoping the familiar voices and laughter would ground him, but his mind kept returning to the fiddler words. Rachel noticed his distracted expression and asked if he was all right. He wanted to tell her about the fiddler, to share the warning he had received, but he could already imagine her brushing it off as festival theatrics. As night fell, the music around the campgrounds grew louder, and more festival-goers crowded near the stage for the evening performances. Joshua tried to relax, to let himself be carried away by the energy of the crowd, but he couldn't shake the sense that he was being watched. His eyes kept drifting back to the edge of the clearing, half expecting to see the fiddler's shadowy form lurking in the trees. Finally, as the last band finished their set and the crowd began to disperse, Joshua saw him again. The fiddler stood just beyond the lights, watching from the shadows, his expression unreadable. But this time, the fiddler didn't play. He simply lifted his hand in a slow, deliberate wave, a gesture that felt more like a farewell than a greeting. Then, as the lights dimmed and the last song faded, the fiddler vanished once more into the darkness. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. Joshua lay awake, staring at the canvas of the tent above him, his mind spinning with the fiddler's cryptic words. Sleep eluded him, and the stillness outside felt heavy, unnatural. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard the faint strains of a fiddle, but it could have been his imagination. As he finally drifted off, a single thought echoed in his mind, chilling him to his core. Twisted Pines doesn't take kindly to visitors who stray too close. The next morning, Joshua awoke with a sense of dread he couldn't quite shake. The sky was overcast, casting a gloomy haze over the festival grounds. He looked around the tent, his friends still asleep, unaware of the strange encounter he'd had with the fiddler the night before. Even with the sun up, the images from the encounter, the haunted music, the cryptic warning, the fiddler's strange, piercing gaze, clung to him like shadows. As he unzipped the tent, he took a deep breath, hoping the fresh air would clear his mind. But when he stepped outside, he found the grounds eerily quiet, with an unnatural stillness that felt more suffocating than refreshing. As Joshua walked through the campsite, he noticed that several tents were empty. Abandoned chairs, half-packed bags, and scattered belongings lay around as though their owners had vanished in a hurry. He frowned, wondering if the festival's reputation for hard partying had caused some festival-goers to leave early. Yet he couldn't ignore the eerie vacancy of it all. It felt as if these people hadn't just left but had been erased, their presence lingering only as an afterthought. When Joshua returned to the tent, he found his friends awake and chatting about the day's lineup. Mark was excited about a headliner band set to play that evening, and Rachel was already mapping out the best food trucks. They seemed blissfully unaware of the eerie emptiness Joshua had observed, and he hesitated to bring it up, afraid of dampening their excitement. But Linda, who had noticed his pale expression, pulled him aside. "You're still thinking about last night, aren't you?" she asked, her tone both concerned and curious. Reluctantly, Joshua told her about the fiddler and his cryptic warning. Linda's expression grew more serious as he spoke, and when he finished, she simply nodded, a thoughtful look on her face. "I think we should keep an eye out," she said quietly. "Something doesn't feel right about this place, but maybe it's just us getting caught up in the atmosphere." They agreed to stay cautious, but Joshua couldn't ignore the tightening feeling in his chest, a sense that they were missing something important, something just beyond their grasp. As the day unfolded, strange occurrences continued. Rachel wandered off to buy souvenirs, but when she returned, she looked confused. "The merch tent was gone," she said, clutching an empty tote bag. "I could have sworn it was right by the main stage." Her brows furrowed, but she shrugged it off, saying maybe she had just mixed up the location. But an hour later, Mark returned from the bathroom, looking unsettled. "I saw someone in the woods," he muttered. "A guy in a cowboy hat. He was just standing there, watching the festival. When I looked back, he was gone." Joshua felt a chill creep up his spine. Linda gave him a knowing look, as if the same suspicion was dawning on her. They weren't seeing things, and they weren't alone in these strange encounters. The festival seemed to be playing tricks on them, shifting and rearranging, making them question what was real. It was as if Twisted Pines itself was watching, feeding off their confusion and uncertainty. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the festival grounds took on an even stranger vibe. The lights around the main stage flickered on, but something was different. The crowd was thinner, and the faces around them looked pale, their expressions hollow. People moved like they were in a trance, swaying to a beat that hadn't started yet. Joshua scanned the area, looking for the fiddler, but there was no sign of him. The headline band took the stage, their introduction greeted by weak applause. The lead singer, a wiry man in faded denim, looked out over the crowd with a vacant expression, as though he were seeing beyond them. When they began to play, the music was off-kilter, distorted like an old record skipping. Joshua's head began to ache, and he noticed Linda rubbing her temples as well. Something was wrong with the music. It wasn't just noise. It was invasive, penetrating, seeping into their minds. Suddenly, the lights on stage dimmed, casting the band in shadows, and a hush fell over the crowd. Joshua glanced around, his heart racing as he noticed people disappearing into the darkness at the edge of the grounds. They drifted off one by one, lured by something unseen. He grabbed Linda's arm, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Do you see that?" She nodded, eyes wide with fear. "They're leaving, but where are they going?" Just then a low, mournful note drifted through the air, the fiddle. Joshua's stomach turned as he recognized the melody from the night before. The crowd froze, as if entranced, and Joshua felt an overpowering urge to follow the sound, to abandon everything and walk toward it. But he fought against it, clinging to Linda, trying to resist the invisible pull. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, the music stopped, leaving a void in its wake. The lights flickered back to life, and the lead singer blinked, looking around in confusion, as if he had just woken from a dream. The audience snapped out of their trance, murmuring to one another, unaware of the strange episode they'd just experienced. But as Joshua looked around, he saw that many of the festival goers were gone, vanished into the night. His friends regrouped, visibly shaken. "What's going on?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. Joshua looked at his friends, his mind racing, a sense of dread settling heavily in his chest. Twisted Pines wasn't just a festival. It was something else, something that seemed to draw people in and slowly, methodically erase them. The next morning, Joshua woke up with a pounding headache, his memories from the night before swirling in his mind like fragments of a half-remembered dream. His friends were already up, quietly packing their things with unusual efficiency, the unspoken consensus that they wanted to leave Twisted Pines as quickly as possible. The eerie events of the past few days had finally eroded their excitement, leaving only a sense of urgency to escape the festival's unsettling hold. But as they gathered their belongings and prepared to head to the car, an unsettling realization hit them. The car was gone. They stared at the empty patch of ground where the car had been parked the night before, the dirt showing faint tire tracks leading out into the road, as though it had simply driven away. Mark immediately began pacing, his voice rising with frustration as he swore they had locked it. Rachel, meanwhile, was silent, her face pale as she clutched her backpack, visibly shaken. Joshua felt a deepening sense of dread, as if Twisted Pines itself were conspiring to keep them here. "We can't just sit around and wait," Linda said finally, her voice steadier than the rest of theirs. "Maybe we can find a phone or some way to call for help. Someone around here has to know what's going on." Her determination seemed to ground them all, and reluctantly, they agreed to search the grounds for answers. They set out, moving cautiously through the eerily quiet festival area, their footsteps echoing in the silence. As they walked, Joshua couldn't help but notice how empty the grounds looked. Many of the tents that had been filled with vendors and festival goers were now abandoned, their owners gone without a trace. Food stands stood empty, half-eaten meals and cups strewn across tables as if their occupants had vanished mid-bite. Joshua's stomach turned as he realized just how many people had disappeared since the festival began. He wondered if anyone would even notice if they disappeared too. As they neared the edge of the forest, they heard a faint rustling in the trees, followed by a low murmur, like voices whispering just out of earshot. The sound was faint but insistent, growing louder the closer they got to the tree line. Joshua strained to make out the words, but they remained indistinct, an eerie chorus that seemed to blend with the wind rustling through the leaves. His skin prickled as he realized the voices sounded familiar, like echoes of conversations he'd had over the past few days. Mark stopped abruptly, his face pale. "Do you guys hear that?" he whispered, his voice tinged with fear. "It sounds like us, like our voices." Joshua listened more closely and felt a chill crawl down his spine. The whispers were indeed fragments of their own conversations, snippets of laughter, and hushed words exchanged in the safety of their tent. But here, in the depths of the forest, they sounded distorted, warped into something sinister. Unable to ignore the pull of the voices, they pressed forward, deeper into the trees. The forest was dense, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. And as they moved, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, surrounding them from all sides. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of their vision, disappearing when they turned to look, as if the forest itself were alive, watching their every move. After what felt like hours of walking, they stumbled upon a clearing bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. At the center of the clearing stood a circle of tall, twisted trees, their bark etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. In the center of the circle stood a single figure, the fiddler. He was playing the same haunting tune Joshua had heard on their first night, the melody resonating through the trees, making the symbols glow brighter with each note. Joshua felt his heart race as he stared at the fiddler, his mind a chaotic swirl of fear and confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. It was as though the music had rendered him mute, trapping him in silence as the fiddler continued to play. The man's gaze swept over them, his eyes dark and hollow, filled with an ancient sorrow that made Joshua's stomach churn. The fiddler finally stopped playing and lowered his instrument, his expression somber as he looked at them. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice carrying an echo that made it sound as if it came from the trees themselves. "Twisted Pines doesn't forgive trespassers. It remembers those who wander too far, who listen too closely." His gaze lingered on Joshua, and he felt an inexplicable weight settle on him, as though the fiddler were seeing into his very soul. "What do you want from us?" Linda asked, her voice trembling but defiant. The fiddler expression softened, a hint of pity flickering in his gaze. "It's not about what I want. It's about what the pines want. They call to those who wander off the path, who seek answers where there should be none." He paused, looking at each of them in turn. "The festival is a lure, a siren song. It brings people here, gives them a taste of joy, and then it takes them." A shiver ran through the group as the meaning of his words sank in. The festival wasn't just a celebration. It was a trap, a way for the forest to claim those it deemed worthy of its curse. Joshua looked at his friends, horror dawning on their faces as they realized the truth. They had been drawn here, lured by the promise of music and laughter, only to be offered up as sacrifices to the forest itself. As the fiddler lifted his bow again, Joshua felt a desperate urge to run, to escape the clearing before the music could bind him once more. But the moment he turned, he found the trees closing in around them, the shadows deepening, swallowing the path they had come from. The fiddler began to play again, a mournful tune that seemed to seep into their bones, filling their minds with visions of twisted trees, endless darkness, and faces long forgotten. The whispers grew louder, blending with the music, and Joshua realized with dawning horror that they were the voices of those who had disappeared, the lost festival-goers, trapped in the forest, their spirits bound to the pines. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This was their fate too, unless they found a way to break the forest's hold. But even as he struggled against the pull of the music, he felt his strength waning, his thoughts blurring. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, drawing him in. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the fiddler's sorrowful gaze, watching as the forest took them, one by one, into its eternal embrace. Joshua awoke on the forest floor, the scent of damp earth filling his senses as he struggled to sit up. His mind felt fractured, as if the eerie music had rearranged his thoughts into disjointed fragments. Glancing around, he saw his friends lying nearby, each of them beginning to stir, their faces pale and dazed. The forest was silent now, save for the soft rustling of leaves, but the quiet was oppressive, an unnatural weight that pressed down on them, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. Linda was the first to regain her voice. "Are we still in the festival grounds?" Her voice was barely a whisper, a fragile attempt to make sense of their surroundings. Joshua shook his head, his throat dry. There was no sign of the festival. The music, the tents, the lights. The forest had changed, transformed into an endless maze of twisted pines and shadows that stretched on for what felt like miles in every direction. Rachel gasped, clutching her arm as she glanced down, and Joshua's heart sank. Etched into her forearm was a thin, faintly glowing symbol, the same symbols they had seen carved into the trees in the clearing. It pulsed with a dim, unsettling light, as if alive. Joshua checked his own arms, then looked at his friends. Each of them bore the same mark. Mark's voice trembled as he spoke. "What did he do to us? Are we cursed?" None of them could answer. The only thing that felt certain was that the fiddler warning had been true. Twisted Pines did not forgive. They had somehow become bound to this place, its silent sentries, the trees, standing watch over them, marking them as part of the forest itself. The reality of their situation was dawning on them in waves, and with it came a creeping terror. They were lost in a labyrinth, with no way out and no sense of direction. Desperation set in as they wandered deeper into the forest, each step carrying them further into the heart of the pines. Every tree looked the same, twisted and ancient, their branches arching overhead like skeletal arms, forming a dense canopy that blotted out the sky. They walked in silence, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound, their voices swallowed by the oppressive quiet. Occasionally, Joshua thought he heard whispers, faint echoes that sent shivers down his spine, like the forest was speaking in a language only it understood. After hours of wandering, they found themselves back in the clearing where they'd first encountered the fiddler. But it was empty now, devoid of any sign of him. Only the twisted trees remained, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them, reaching like fingers. The symbols carved into the trunks glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the marks on their arms. It was as if they were connected, bound to the forest through an invisible thread that they couldn't break. A feeling of helplessness began to take hold. Linda looked at the others, her eyes wide with fear. What if we're just walking in circles? What if this is all a trick to keep us here forever? Her voice cracked, and Joshua felt a pang of guilt. He'd been the one who'd insisted they come to the festival, convinced it would be nothing more than a weekend of music and fun. Now, they were trapped, their very identities slowly eroding as the pines took hold of them. Desperation soon turned to panic as Mark began calling out for help, his voice echoing through the trees. But the only response was the whispering wind and the rustling of leaves, as if the forest itself were mocking them. They were alone, isolated in a world that seemed to exist outside of reality, a place where the rules of time and space had twisted, leaving them with no hope of escape. Just as their despair reached a fever pitch, a strange figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, clad in an old-fashioned dress, her face pale and expressionless, her eyes empty. She stood silently, watching them with an unsettling calm. Joshua's heart raced as he realized she wasn't part of the festival or a camper. She looked like she had stepped out of another era entirely. The woman raised a hand and gestured for them to follow, then turned and began to walk slowly into the forest. Despite their fear, they found themselves drawn to her, as if some invisible force compelled them forward. They followed her through winding paths and dense thickets, each step filling them with both dread and hope. Perhaps she was leading them out, perhaps she knew the way to escape. But as they walked, the symbols on their arms grew warmer, pulsing in time with each step, and a sickening realization dawned on Joshua. They weren't getting closer to freedom, They were being led deeper into the forest, into the pine's very core. The woman's figure began to shimmer, flickering like a mirage, her form dissolving into the trees as they reached another clearing. This one was different from the others, darker, with the trees standing in a tight circle, their branches woven together like the bars of a cage. In the center of the clearing was a single, ancient tree, its trunk wider than any they'd seen, and its bark covered in thousands of carved symbols, each one pulsing faintly in the darkness. The marks on their arms burned as they approached, as if the tree were drawing them in, calling them to become part of its twisted legacy. The woman turned to face them one last time, her expression shifting into a haunting smile. "You are the newest stories in the pines," she whispered, her voice merging with the whispering wind. "All who enter here become part of it, bound forever to its memory. Welcome to the heart of Twisted Pines." In that moment, Joshua understood the terrible truth. This wasn't just a festival or a trap. It was a living entity, an ancient, insatiable force that fed on memories, on lives, binding them to its endless, shadowed depths. The woman's form faded into the tree, her face etched into the bark like a ghostly mask, joining countless others who had come before them. They tried to scream, to run, but their bodies felt heavy, rooted to the ground as the marks on their arms flared with unbearable heat. Joshua's vision blurred, and he could feel the pines tightening around them, drawing them into its depths, their souls becoming threads in its eternal tapestry. In that silent, forsaken clearing, the friends vanished, their whispers joining the echoes in the trees, their memories becoming part of Twisted Pines forever. The heavy silence that followed their vanishing lingered like a weight in the clearing, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves, as if the pines themselves were sighing in satisfaction. Yet, as moments slipped by, a strange thing happened. Joshua, feeling as though he'd been submerged in darkness, gradually became aware of a faint light glowing somewhere beyond him. His senses seemed dulled, his limbs leaden, but he could perceive a shape, something pulling him back from the depths he'd been falling into. He blinked, and the world sharpened around him. He found himself standing, though he had no memory of rising, his friends beside him, their expressions mirroring his own confusion. The forest was no longer shadowed and twisted, but bright and eerily still, as if the air itself had been frozen. A peculiar, tingling sensation ran through Joshua's skin, and he noticed with a jolt that the glowing mark on his arm had dimmed, leaving only a faint scar where it had once burned. Ahead of them, the ancient tree remained, towering and gnarled, but different somehow. The symbols carved into its bark no longer pulsed, their light extinguished. But what caught Joshua's attention was the figure standing at the base of the tree, an old man dressed in worn clothing that seemed to blend with the surrounding forest, his features shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His face was marked by deep lines, his eyes clouded yet sharp, holding an unsettling mixture of wisdom and warning. "Ah, so the pines let you go. After all," the man murmured, his voice rough but calm. "Not many get a second chance once the forest takes them." His gaze swept over each of them, lingering on the faint scars on their arms, as if he were reading the story etched into their skin. Joshua's heart raced, a mixture of relief and dread flooding him. The forest had released them, but at what cost? Who are you?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. The man looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I am the Keeper of Shadows, the one who watches over this place, the one who records the stories that the pines consume." His words were calm, but they filled Joshua with an inexplicable fear, as if they were in the presence of something both ancient and inhuman. The Keeper's gaze settled on Joshua, a piercing stare that seemed to bore into his very soul. "You came seeking a festival, a night of music and joy," he continued, his voice low and somber. "But Twisted Pines is no ordinary festival. It's a place where the forest collects memories, binds them, weaves them into its roots. It survives on stories on the lives it claims. It is ancient and eternal, and once it takes you, you become part of it forever." The friends exchanged uneasy glances, a sickening realization settling over them. They hadn't simply stumbled upon a festival. They had been lured here, ensnared by something far beyond their understanding. The music, the lights, even the festivities had all been part of the trap, a carefully orchestrated illusion to draw them deeper into the forest's grasp. The keeper's eyes softened slightly, as if sensing their distress. "Not all who come here are claimed," he said. "Sometimes, if the pines are satisfied, they release their captives. Those whose stories are worth telling, but not worth keeping." He paused, a shadow of something like sadness passing over his face. "You have been given a rare gift, a second chance to leave. But know this, the pines do not forgive, and they do not forget." Mark, unable to hold back his frustration, stepped forward. "But why us? Why were we chosen? We didn't do anything wrong." His voice echoed in the clearing, raw with anger and desperation. The keeper simply shrugged, an ancient weariness evident in his posture. "The forest chooses whom it will. It doesn't follow the rules of your world. It knows only hunger and history, and it has no mercy for those who wander too close." A cold shiver ran down Joshua's spine as he listened. He realized that the forest didn't care about justice or fairness. It existed beyond such concepts, bound only by its own dark purpose. And he understood, with a clarity that left him breathless, that they were alive now only because the forest had deemed them unworthy of keeping. The thought filled him with a twisted sense of gratitude and resentment. The keeper watched their silent struggle, his face impassive. "The path out is open for now. You must go before the forest changes its mind." He pointed to a narrow trail that seemed to lead out of the clearing, its edges lined with thick, twisted vines that looked almost like they were alive. "Follow this path, and do not look back, no matter what you hear or see." The group hesitated, each of them glancing at the others, a mixture of relief and apprehension in their eyes. They had been given a chance to escape, but the cost of that freedom weighed heavily on them. Each step they took away from the clearing felt like a betrayal of the unknown lives that had been claimed by the forest, voices that would forever be lost among the pines. As they began to walk down the path, Joshua couldn't help but steal one last glance over his shoulder. The keeper stood in the clearing, watching them with an inscrutable expression, his figure slowly fading into the shadows of the trees. The forest seemed to sigh as they left, a low, mournful sound that echoed through the pines, as if the trees were disappointed to see them go. The path twisted and turned, leading them through dense thickets and over-tangled roots. The forest seemed to shift around them, as if guiding them out, but making sure they didn't stray from the path. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, and Joshua could have sworn he saw faces among the trees, watching them with hollow eyes, silent witnesses to their escape. As they neared the edge of the forest, a faint sound reached their ears, a distant, haunting melody, the same tune the fiddler had played, echoing softly through the trees. Joshua's heart skipped a beat, a lingering fear tightening his chest. The melody grew fainter as they continued walking, but its eerie beauty stayed with them, a reminder of the darkness they had escaped. Finally, they broke through the tree line, stumbling into the warm, golden light of the early morning. They were back in the parking lot, the festival grounds now eerily empty, the remnants of tents and stalls abandoned, as if no one had been there at all. Their car was back, parked exactly where they'd left it, its doors unlocked as if waiting for them. Joshua looked at his friends, a sense of disbelief mingling with relief as they climbed into the car. None of them spoke as he started the engine, each of them lost in their own thoughts, the weight of their experience hanging heavy in the air. As they drove away from Twisted Pines, leaving the haunted forest behind, Joshua knew that they would never be the same. They had seen things, experienced things that defied explanation, and though they had escaped, a part of them would always remain bound to the pines. And as the last notes of the fiddler tune faded into the distance, Joshua felt an unshakable certainty that Twisted Pines was far from finished with them. Days passed in a haze after the friends' narrow escape from Twisted Pines, but the horrors they'd encountered in the forest lingered in their minds. Joshua tried to push the memories away, immersing himself in his daily routines. Yet he felt like a shadow trailed him wherever he went. Nights were the worst, his dreams haunted by faces he couldn't recognize and a melody that seeped into his subconscious, elusive yet familiar. He could still feel the damp chill of the forest and see the gleaming eyes of the keepers staring through him, a silent promise that their encounter wasn't truly over. The group's bond grew tense. Once they'd thrived on their shared experiences, but now silence filled the spaces between them. Linda, usually the pragmatic one, started carrying charms and herbs, muttering about protection rituals. Mark withdrew completely, refusing to answer calls and even avoiding his friends around town. Each of them felt the lingering effects of their encounter differently, yet none could shake the feeling that something had followed them out of the forest. One evening, as Joshua was about to drift off to sleep, his phone lit up with a message from Linda. "Meet me at the diner. We need to talk." He arrived to find her waiting at their usual booth, her face drawn and tired. A faint smell of incense clung to her, and Joshua noticed a small talisman hanging from her neck, a carved symbol resembling the one they'd seen in the forest. "I've been having dreams," she began without preamble, her voice barely a whisper. "But they don't feel like dreams. Every night, I see the Keeper. He's always standing in that clearing, watching us, calling us back. And last night, he said he's not finished with us." Her eyes darted around the room, as if she feared the walls themselves were listening. Joshua felt a chill race up his spine. He, too, had been plagued by dreams, though he hadn't dared speak of them, hoping that silence would banish them. He confessed as much, and Linda nodded, her expression grim. "It's the forest, Joshua. I think it left something with us. I don't think it's letting go." The words hung heavy in the air, and Joshua realized she was right. Their escape had been a temporary reprieve, a courtesy granted by something far beyond their understanding. Mark finally agreed to meet them a few nights later, but his demeanor had shifted. He was disheveled, his eyes darting around as if he could see something none of them could. He clutched a piece of crumpled paper, which he laid on the table without a word. Joshua leaned over to see a crude map of Twisted Pines, with circles and lines etched around the clearing where they'd seen the Keeper. "It's not over," Mark said hoarsely. "I keep seeing him. I think he's showing me the way back." Linda's face turned pale as Mark spoke, but she leaned in, her fingers trembling. "Then maybe we have to go back," she murmured. "Maybe there's something we left behind, something that's binding us." Her voice was laced with reluctance, yet a dark determination had taken hold of her, as if she knew there would be no peace until they returned. The idea weighed heavily on Joshua. He knew it was reckless, but the strange pull he felt each night, the shadows lurking in his peripheral vision, and the recurring dreams had worn him down. He'd hoped it was all his imagination, but seeing the same unease mirrored in his friends convinced him that they were, in some twisted way, connected to Twisted Pines. A lingering trace of the forest clung to them, urging them back. A plan began to form. They would drive back to Twisted Pines at nightfall, hoping that facing whatever awaited them might finally sever the hold the forest had over their minds. Linda brought her charms and incense, Mark his hastily drawn map, and Joshua a pocket knife that felt like an empty gesture of protection. None of them expected to return to the same carefree festival they'd been lured into weeks before. They knew they were heading back into something darker, something unbound by the rules of the living world. As they pulled into the outskirts of the forest, Joshua felt the oppressive weight of Twisted Pines settle over him, thickening the air. The familiar trail wound through the undergrowth, leading them back toward the clearing where they'd first encountered the Keeper. The silence was so complete it swallowed their footsteps, the soft crunch of leaves barely audible. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself resisted their intrusion. They reached the clearing, the ancient tree looming like a twisted sentinel in the moonlight. The carved symbols on its bark seemed to flicker, though there was no light source to create such an effect. Joshua felt a shiver run down his spine as he looked up and saw that the Keeper was already there, waiting in the shadows as if he had known they would return. The Keeper's voice, a dry whisper like leaves scraping together, drifted through the clearing. "I warned you," he intoned, his gaze shifting between them. "The forest never lets go. You are bound by the stories it keeps." Joshua felt his stomach twist as the keeper gestured toward the tree, his eyes dark and hungry. "Every soul that leaves here owes a part of itself to the pines, and your debt is unpaid." Linda clutched her talisman tightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. But the keeper merely chuckled, a low, hollow sound that resonated in the silence. "Symbols cannot save you. Only the truth can." His gaze settled on each of them in turn, a slow, predatory stare. "If you wish to be free, then you must give something back." Fear gripped Joshua, and he realized that the keeper was asking for a sacrifice, a story, a memory, something precious enough to appease the forest. His mind raced, the weight of the keeper's gaze making it impossible to think. But as he looked around at his friends, he understood that they were all tethered here by the same haunting memories, a debt they could only repay together. The friends exchanged fearful glances, their resolve faltering. They'd come here seeking closure, but they hadn't expected the cost. The keeper's dark eyes glinted with cruel satisfaction, his figure merging with the shadows of the trees as he waited, patient as the forest that held their souls in its grasp. As the keeper's hollow gaze pressed into them, the three friends felt the weight of the forest's ancient secrets coiling around them, drawing them into a tale that was older than any of them could fathom. The silence grew almost sentient, a presence with its own rhythm and heartbeat, tethering them to the eerie clearing and the gnarled tree at its center. Joshua, his pulse throbbing in his throat, understood with dawning horror that their escape from the forest weeks earlier had been a mere delay, not an end. Mark, still clutching his crude map with trembling fingers, was the first to speak, his voice a faint murmur against the oppressive quiet. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his tone laced with a desperate vulnerability. The keeper's shadowed form shifted slightly, his features barely discernible in the dim light, yet somehow his eyes gleamed, cold and knowing. A hand, pale and skeletal, gestured toward the base of the ancient tree, where strange symbols lay etched in the dirt, lines and curves that pulsed with a faint light. The keeper's voice seeped through the stillness, low and raspy, barely above a whisper. "The forest holds the stories of those who have wandered into its heart," he murmured. "Those who leave must offer something in return. A piece of your truth, a memory you cannot reclaim." His gaze moved from Joshua to Mark, then lingered on Linda, each of them frozen under his penetrating stare. Linda's face was pale, her grip on her charm loosening as she processed his words. "A memory?" she echoed, confusion and fear swirling in her voice. "What could a memory possibly mean to you?" The keeper's lips curved in a chilling approximation of a smile. "The forest does not ask for what it does not need. Your memories, your secrets, your fears, they are threads in its tapestry. And you, intruders, must offer your own." For a long, agonizing moment, none of them moved. The thought of relinquishing a memory seemed trivial at first glance, yet each of them sensed that this demand was no simple request. They understood, in a way that defied logic, that offering even a single memory would strip them of something essential. They would lose more than a moment of recollection. They would lose a part of themselves, some inextricable detail that had shaped who they were. After an agonizing pause, Joshua stepped forward, his breath ragged. "I'll give something," he said, his voice hollow yet resolved. He felt Linda and Mark's eyes on him, filled with a mix of disbelief and reluctant admiration. The keeper's smile grew, and he gestured for Joshua to come closer to the tree. The air grew thick as he approached, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves overwhelming. Joshua closed his eyes, searching through the labyrinth of his memories, and found himself drawn to a moment from childhood. A summer day spent with his father by a lake, laughing as they skipped stones across the water. It was a memory that he held close, one that anchored him during difficult times. With a silent farewell, he offered it up, feeling the moment slip from his mind like water through open hands. When he opened his eyes, he was disoriented, as if something vital had been pulled from his core. The forest responded immediately. The symbols at the base of the tree flickered, then glowed brighter, as though the keeper had absorbed Joshua's memory into the roots themselves. Joshua staggered back, dazed, feeling an unfamiliar hollowness in his chest. He could sense the absence, an emptiness where that cherished memory had once been, and he could not quite shake the feeling that he was somehow less complete. Linda stepped forward next, her face set in grim determination. She didn't hesitate as long as Joshua had, choosing quickly. She offered a memory of her grandmother's last words, a moment that had been etched in her heart. As the memory vanished, her face paled, her eyes widening with the realization of what she'd surrendered. The keeper watched impassively, absorbing her pain with a detached satisfaction. Mark, hesitant and visibly shaken, was the last. He faltered, glancing back at his friends, but he knew there was no turning back. After a moment, he let go of a memory he hadn't spoken of in years. His first love, a fleeting but intense romance that had ended in heartbreak. As the memory dissolved, he looked devastated, as though he had handed over a piece of his own identity. The keeper regarded them with a silent satisfaction, his form retreating slightly, blending into the twisted shadows of the ancient tree. "You are bound to this place, but the debt has been lessened," he murmured, his voice softer now, almost compassionate. "You may leave, but know this. The forest remembers what it has given. Should you return, it will ask for more." As the keeper's figure faded, the clearing grew brighter, as if the oppressive fog that had clung to the forest was beginning to lift. Joshua, Linda, and Mark stood in silence, each grappling with the emptiness left by what they had given. The forest no longer felt as hostile, yet an uncanny sense of finality loomed, as though they were leaving a piece of themselves forever entwined within its depths. They stumbled back to their car in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The journey back to town was somber, marked by an unsettling realization they had not escaped unscathed. The forest had taken something irreplaceable, something that left them each feeling fractured, as if parts of their souls were still wandering within twisted pines. As they parted ways that night, none of them spoke about the ordeal. Yet each of them knew, in the way one knows the certainty of a storm on the horizon, that the forest's hold on them was not truly broken. Days passed, but the forest's claim on Joshua, Linda, and Mark lingered in unexpected ways. They had returned to their normal lives, yet each felt a subtle, inescapable absence, a hollow ache where their memories had been taken. Joshua noticed it most in his quiet moments, like when he would stare at his reflection in the bathroom mirror and realize he couldn't remember the warmth of his father's laughter or the way they'd spent that day by the lake. That memory, once a treasured part of him, had vanished as if it had never existed. For Linda, the loss gnawed at her constantly. Her grandmother's last words, the ones she'd once clung to, had become distant and blurred, leaving her struggling to remember the comfort they'd brought her. Now, every night as she tried to sleep, she found herself replaying fractured scenes in her mind, fragments of her life she couldn't quite piece together, as if her very sense of self was slipping away. Mark seemed to fare the worst. The memory of his first love, that intense yet brief romance, had been a defining part of him, an experience he would often revisit in moments of quiet introspection. Now, without it, he felt untethered, unsure of how to connect with others. He found himself irritable, prone to isolation, and increasingly obsessed with finding some way to regain what he had lost. It was as if the forest had not only taken the memory itself, but had also left behind a void that continued to consume him. Their friendships, once bound by a shared sense of purpose and camaraderie, grew strained under the weight of what had happened. Simple conversations felt forced, each of them hyper-aware of the parts of themselves that were missing. They began meeting less frequently, each retreating into their own solitude, yet unable to fully escape the haunting connection they still felt to Twisted Pines. One evening, Joshua sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, replaying the events of their return to the forest over and over. His mind kept circling back to the keeper's cryptic words, "The forest remembers what it has given." The phrase, spoken with chilling finality, echoed through his thoughts, stirring something deep within him. He couldn't help but wonder if the forest hadn't simply taken their memories but was now feeding on them in some way. He felt compelled to reach out to Linda and Mark to share this disturbing thought and see if they too were feeling the same inexplicable pull back toward Twisted Pines. The next day, he called Linda, who agreed to meet him at the diner, though her voice was tense and wary. When they met, Joshua noticed the dark circles under her eyes, her gaze haunted and distant. She admitted that she hadn't been sleeping well, that every time she closed her eyes, she would hear faint whispers, voices that seemed to call her back to the forest. "It's like I can't move on," she whispered, clutching her coffee mug with trembling hands. "Like part of me is still there." Mark joined them reluctantly, his appearance even more disheveled than before, a far cry from the friend they once knew. He looked thinner, his skin pale, eyes hollow and unfocused. He spoke in fragmented sentences, barely acknowledging the others, and spent most of the time staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. But when Joshua shared his theory about the forest feeding on their memories, Mark snapped to attention, his face contorting with a mixture of fear and anger. "So, you think it's not over then?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You think that place is still taking from us?" The question lingered heavily in the air, and though none of them wanted to admit it, they each knew the answer. Since returning from the forest, they had felt incomplete, as if they were still in debt to something vast and insatiable. The keeper had said their debt was lessened, not erased, a subtle distinction that hinted at a truth none of them wanted to face. Over the following weeks, each of them began experiencing strange phenomena that seemed tied to the memories they had lost. Joshua would catch glimpses of his reflection in windows, only to see a younger version of himself staring back, a flicker of someone who no longer existed within him. Linda reported feeling cold spots in her apartment, places where she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, but only in fragments, like a broken melody that faded as soon as she tried to focus on it. Mark's experiences were perhaps the most disturbing. He began receiving letters, written in handwriting he didn't recognize, but the words spoke directly to him, as though an old lover was reaching out from beyond time, pulling him back into memories that no longer belonged to him. He tried to burn the letters, but they reappeared in his mailbox the following day, untouched and intact, as though the forest itself was taunting him. As each of them grew increasingly disturbed by these experiences, their lives spiraled into chaos. Linda lost her job, unable to keep up with the demands of daily life, while struggling with the haunting voices. Mark stopped answering calls entirely, retreating into isolation, his mind unraveling under the weight of his obsession with the letters. Joshua, now plagued by insomnia and haunted by fragmented reflections of his younger self, began questioning his own sanity. Desperate for answers, Joshua eventually reached out to a local historian who specialized in folklore and urban legends, hoping that someone with knowledge of the area might provide insight. The historian listened intently, his face pale and solemn as Joshua described their encounter with the keeper. Twisted Pines is old land, the historian explained, older than most realize. It's said that those who trespass into the deeper parts of the forest are marked, bound to it by a debt that can never be repaid. Some say that the forest collects memories, stories, lives themselves, to preserve something lost long ago. The historian went on to tell of countless others who had ventured into Twisted Pines, only to emerge changed, as though they were missing parts of their very souls. He explained that the forest was rumored to guard something ancient, something that required offerings in the form of memories, fragments of those who dared enter. And once it had marked a person, the forest would continue to haunt them, reaching across distance and time. Joshua left the historian's office feeling a profound sense of dread, a confirmation of what he had feared all along. They had not simply escaped with missing memories. They had become part of something far larger, something they could never fully break free from. The forest, with its keeper and its secrets, was now bound to them, a quiet haunting that would follow them for the rest of their lives. As Joshua returned home, he realized with a sinking heart that Twisted Pines would never truly let them go. The forest shadows stretched far beyond its boundaries, reaching into their very lives, their memories, their futures. In giving up pieces of themselves, they had inadvertently sown the seeds of their own haunting, a binding that would never cease, whispering to them from the shadows, drawing them closer, until they finally gave themselves over to the keeper entirely. The weeks after Joshua's meeting with the historian felt like a slow descent into madness. Despite the clarity the historian had provided, the truth they now faced was one that none of them were ready to confront. The realization that their debt to Twisted Pines was not merely a fleeting consequence, but an inescapable bond set the stage for their gradual unraveling. Each day felt like a ripple in a growing tide, carrying them further from the lives they once knew, towards something far darker and more insidious. Joshua's own mental state, which had already been fragile, worsened. His nights were filled with vivid dreams of the forest, where he would walk through the misty trees and hear his father's laughter just out of reach. Yet every time he reached out, the sound would fade into a whisper, replaced by the eerie voice of the keeper, calling him deeper into the woods. He would wake drenched in sweat, the phantom laughter still echoing in his mind. It was as though the forest was trying to steal even the remnants of his memories, turning them into fragments that would never quite belong to him again. Linda, too, felt herself slipping. She had always been a pragmatic person, grounded in reality. Yet the supernatural forces that seemed to be at play had shaken her to her core. Her grandmother's absence, once a pain she could manage, had become an overwhelming void that consumed her. It wasn't just the memory that had faded. It was her connection to her own past, her identity. She began experiencing lapses in time, moments where she would find herself in places she couldn't remember going, speaking to people she had no recollection of meeting. She would reach for her phone to call someone, only to realize that the name she meant to dial was gone from her contacts, erased as though it had never been there. Mark's descent into paranoia was perhaps the most extreme. The letters he had received, the ones he couldn't seem to escape, began to take on a more menacing tone. They no longer spoke of his lost love, but began detailing his every move, his every thought. The handwriting, which once felt foreign, now seemed oddly familiar, almost as if it were his own hand scrawling the words on the page. "Come back," they would say. "You belong here. You're already ours." Every letter filled him with a sense of foreboding, like the forest itself was stalking him, waiting for the moment when he would finally return, offering himself completely. The trio's connection, once a lifeline, had become strained and fragile. They had stopped meeting as often, unable to face each other without the uncomfortable silence of their shared burden. Joshua and Linda tried reaching out to Mark, but his responses became more erratic, and eventually, his phone went silent. Linda, now increasingly anxious, urged Joshua to go to Mark's apartment, fearing that he had disappeared altogether. When they arrived, Mark's door was ajar, and the apartment was empty, save for the letters piled high on the coffee table. The same message repeated in every single one: "The forest is calling. Come home." Their search for Mark took them back to the edge of the woods, where the memories they had lost seemed to pulse in the air. As they walked into the clearing, the oppressive weight of the forest pressed in on them once more, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. It was as though the trees were alive, watching them, waiting for them to make a move. Joshua's heart raced as he realized that the forest hadn't let them go. It had been pulling them back all along, slowly but surely, making them part of something they couldn't escape. It was in the very heart of the forest that they found Mark, though not in the way they had hoped. He stood at the base of the ancient tree, his face blank, his eyes vacant, as if he had lost all recognition of who he was. His body trembled slightly, as though caught in some unseen current. The letters were scattered around him, some half buried in the dirt, others clutched in his hands. When Joshua called his name, Mark turned slowly, his eyes clouded, distant. "They said it was time," he whispered, his voice hollow. "I belong here now." Linda and Joshua reached out to him, but as they tried to pull him away, a sudden force seemed to surge from the ground itself. The earth beneath their feet trembled, and the symbols at the base of the tree began to glow with an unsettling intensity. The keeper's voice echoed in the wind, carrying a promise that chilled them to the bone. The forest claims what it is owed. You cannot leave. You are mine. With an unnatural strength, Mark broke free from their grasp, stepping toward the tree with an eerie sense of calm. His movements were mechanical, almost like a puppet controlled by some unseen hand. I have to go, he murmured, his voice devoid of emotion. It's what the forest wants. It's what I was always meant to do. Before they could stop him, Mark reached out and touched the tree, his fingers sinking into the bark as though it were soft clay. A low hum vibrated through the ground, and the air around them seemed to warp, distorting everything in a way that made reality itself feel tenuous. Joshua and Linda stood frozen, unable to move as Mark's body began to dissolve, absorbed into the tree. He screamed, once briefly, before his voice was swallowed by the darkness. The light from the symbols flickered and then dimmed. In the silence that followed, the forest seemed to breathe, and Joshua and Linda were left standing alone. Their friend, their companion, was gone, lost to the forest, swallowed by its ancient hunger. There was no body, no trace of him left, only the faintest whisper of his voice, still echoing in the air, as if he had never truly left. Linda collapsed to her knees, her mind reeling, unable to comprehend what had just transpired. Joshua stood motionless, staring at the spot where Mark had been, his thoughts a whirl of confusion and disbelief. How could they have let it come to this? How had the forest taken Mark so completely, so effortlessly? And yet, deep down, both of them knew the truth. They had never really escaped. The forest had never let them go, not truly. It had simply been biding its time, waiting for the moment when their bond would be complete. Now, with Mark lost and the forest's grip tightening, they were left with the realization that they, too, were part of the forest's eternal story. There would be no return to normal life, no reclaiming the memories they had lost. The past, the present, and the future were now intertwined in a way they couldn't escape. The forest's whisper surrounded them, and in that moment, both Joshua and Linda understood the full depth of the keeper's warning. The forest remembers what it has given. They had given it their memories. They had given it Mark. And now, they too, would be drawn into the forest's shadow, never truly free again. Joshua and Linda stood frozen in the eerie silence of the forest, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling around them like an oppressive fog. Mark was gone, and with him, a part of their sanity seemed to have evaporated into the night air. The ancient trees towered above them, their gnarled branches twisting into the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to pulse with life. It felt as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for them to make a choice. Though whether that choice was theirs to make at all, they couldn't say. The minutes passed like hours. Every breath seemed unnatural, every movement clumsy as they struggled to comprehend the events unfolding before them. How could they have allowed this to happen? How could they have stood by while Mark, their friend, was absorbed into the forest itself, his existence fading away like smoke on the wind? The confusion in their minds was met with a rising sense of dread, as if something had shifted within them too. Something they couldn't name, but could feel, a presence, an awareness that was now firmly attached to their souls. Joshua tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The keeper's voice, that cold and unearthly tone, still reverberated in his mind. The forest claims what it is owed. You cannot leave. You are mine. Was this the forest's final, irrevocable claim? Had they truly crossed a line they could never return from? The thought that they were no longer the masters of their fate, but simply pawns in a larger game, filled him with an indescribable terror. Linda, too, could sense it, the forest grip tightening around them, drawing them in like a slow tide. She clutched her chest, as if to hold herself together, but every instinct in her screamed to run, to flee, to escape. Yet, there was no escape. The very air seemed to conspire against them, pressing in with an unnatural heaviness that rendered every movement slow and laborious. There was no way out of the forest, not anymore, not after what they had seen, not after what they had lost. The silence was broken by the soft rustle of leaves, a sound that felt out of place in the stillness. Joshua's head snapped up, his heart racing. He wasn't sure if he had heard it or if it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But there it was again, a whisper carried on the wind. A voice. Not the keeper's this time, but something different, something more familiar. It was a voice he hadn't heard in years. Joshua, his blood ran cold. He turned slowly, desperately searching for the source of the voice. At first he saw nothing. Then from between the darkened trunks of the trees, a figure emerged. A woman, standing motionless in the shadows. She was tall, with long, dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders in waves. Her face was obscured by the low light, but something about her felt painfully familiar. His heart skipped a beat. "Mom?" Joshua's voice barely escaped his lips. The words felt hollow, empty, as if he wasn't quite sure he was saying them at all. The woman's eyes glowed faintly in the dimness, and her lips curved into a soft smile. "You've come far, my son," she said in a voice that sent chills down his spine. "Farther than I ever thought you would. Farther than I ever wanted you to go." Linda's gaze shifted between Joshua and the figure, her expression one of bewildered horror. She had never met Joshua's mother, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her. There was something wrong about this woman, something unnatural about the way she stood, as though she didn't belong to the world they knew. The woman's gaze turned toward Linda, her smile widening. "Ah, you brought a friend," she mused. "How quaint. You've been the loyal companion, haven't you, Linda?" Watching Joshua from the shadows, hoping he'd wake from this nightmare. "But you two are caught now. You cannot leave either." The words were like poison, slowly seeping into Linda's mind. She felt her pulse quicken, her thoughts spinning in circles. She wanted to run, to scream, but she felt paralyzed. Every fiber of her being was telling her that something was terribly wrong, that whatever was happening here was beyond her understanding. Joshua, on the other hand, took a tentative step forward, his eyes locked on the figure before him. The woman, his mother, stood still, as if waiting for him to approach. Her presence seemed to draw him in, pulling at something deep inside him. He wanted to understand, wanted to hear the truth. But the truth, he realized now, was more elusive than he could have ever imagined. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why did you leave me? Why didn't you ever come back?" The woman's smile faded, replaced by a look of sorrow. "I never left you, Joshua. I've always been here, waiting for you to find me, waiting for you to understand why we can never truly leave, why this forest calls to us, why it claims us. This place, this land, it belongs to the keeper. It always has. And now you must join us. All of you." Joshua's mind reeled, the implications of her words sinking in like a heavy stone. The forest, the keeper, the strange occurrences that had followed them since they arrived, it was all connected. They had never stood a chance. The moment they entered Twisted Pines, they had sealed their fate. The forest didn't want them to escape. It wanted them to return, to become part of its eternal hunger. The woman's form flickered in the shadows, as if she were being pulled in two directions. "You have a choice, Joshua. The keeper has made an offer. He will take what he is owed, and you will be free of this torment. But to do so, you must give him something in return. You must offer what you've been hiding from him, what you've been hiding from yourself." Linda's heart raced. What was Joshua being asked to give? And why was it so important that the keeper wanted them to make this sacrifice? "Take my hand," the woman whispered, her voice soft but insistent. "Join us. It's time to stop running." Joshua stood still, torn between the strange allure of his mother's presence and the harsh reality that her very existence in this form was wrong. The woman before him wasn't truly his mother. She couldn't be. His mother was gone, had been gone for years. This was something else, something the forest had created, something twisted. But the choice hung heavy in the air, like a final decision that would define not just his fate, but Linda's as well. The keeper had made his offer. Now, they had to decide whether to accept the price that came with it, or fight back against the force that had been closing in on them all along. Joshua stood motionless, torn between the apparition of his mother and the horrifying truth gnawing at the edges of his mind. The woods seemed to close in around them, a palpable weight pressing against his chest as he fought to comprehend the choice before him. He could hear Linda's breath quickening beside him, feel her anxiety radiating, yet neither of them dared to make a move. It was as if the air itself had thickened, become treacherous, ready to snap at the slightest sign of resistance or submission. His mind screamed for clarity, but there was none. The woman, his mother, or at least something pretending to be her, had offered him a way out, an escape from this nightmare. Yet, with every word she spoke, it became clearer that the path to freedom came at an unimaginable cost. He wanted to run, to grab Linda's hand and flee, but he knew it was too late. The forest had already claimed them, its tendrils wrapped tightly around their souls. "Join us, Joshua," the woman repeated, her voice lilting and coaxing, like a lullaby meant to lull him into submission. The keeper's offer is simple. He takes what is his, and in return, you and your friend will be freed from this place. You won't be bound to it any longer. But Joshua knew the price. He could feel it, like a subtle pulse beneath his skin, urging him to accept. The keeper's words echoed in his mind. "You cannot leave. You are mine." There was no escaping that truth now. The forest, the keeper, the woman standing before him. It was all part of the same malevolent force that sought to possess them, to absorb them into the wood's insatiable hunger. It was a force that didn't just want their lives. It wanted their very essence, their souls. Why now? Joshua finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a rasp. "Why this price? Why do you want us?" The woman's eyes, cold and knowing, met his gaze. "It's always been the same, Joshua. The keeper takes, but only when the time is right. He's patient. And you, my dear, you've been part of his plan from the beginning. The forest has always known you. It's always watched you. You were never truly free, not in the way you thought. This place calls to you, as it calls to all who enter. But you are the one who can release it." Linda's hand trembled as she reached out, gripping Joshua's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Joshua, don't listen to her. This isn't real. None of this is. You can fight it. We can fight it." But Joshua wasn't sure if he could. Deep down, a part of him felt an overwhelming pull, an insidious connection to this place. It was as if the forest had always been part of him, always waiting for the right moment to claim him fully. He could feel the hunger inside him, the dark allure that promised freedom, but only if he was willing to give up something precious in return. "You said I could be free," Joshua spoke again, his voice now steady, though his heart was far from calm. "But I have to give something up? What do you want?" The woman's smile widened, and for a moment, she looked less like his mother and more like a predatory figure, one who had seen through all his illusions. "The keeper does not want anything as simple as your life, Joshua. He doesn't want your blood, your flesh. What he wants is far deeper than that. He wants your memories, your soul, the very part of you that is tied to this place." A chill ran down Joshua's spine. He understood then, perhaps more than he ever wanted to. The keeper wasn't interested in just killing him or taking his life. He wanted something far more intimate, more final. He wanted the essence of who Joshua was, the very part of him that had lived, had dreamed, had loved, and had suffered. If Joshua accepted this deal, he would lose himself. He would be consumed, his very identity erased and woven into the dark fabric of the forest, never to be seen again. Linda pulled on his arm, trying to break his trance. "Joshua, don't. You're not listening to her. She's not your mother. This is all a lie." Her voice cracked, desperation leaking through her words. But it was as if Joshua couldn't hear her anymore. The world had narrowed to a single point, a choice that could either shatter him or set him free. But freedom was an illusion, wasn't it? There was no escaping the forest's hold. The keeper had already marked them, sealed their fate the moment they stepped into Twisted Pines. The offer, the price, it was all part of the trap, a trap set by something ancient and powerful. Joshua realized then that the forest had always been waiting for him, had always known he would come back to it. It was as though his return had been written in the trees, etched into the very soil beneath his feet. Suddenly, The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the woman's image flickered, distorting into something even darker, more monstrous. Her eyes now glowed with a sickly yellow light, and her once gentle voice had turned into something jagged and sharp. "You've made your choice, Joshua. The keeper will take what he is owed. But make no mistake, you cannot walk away unchanged." Joshua took a step back, his thoughts spinning. Was this truly a choice? Or had the forest already decided his fate, and he was merely a pawn in its game? Could he really resist? Could he truly fight against something so vast, so ancient, that it had consumed everything around him, even his memories? "Joshua!" Linda's voice snapped him from his daze. She was shaking him now, her face filled with fear and pleading. "This isn't you. You can fight it. You have to." For the first time since he had stepped into this nightmare, Joshua felt a flicker of defiance stir in his chest. Perhaps the price the keeper offered wasn't just his soul. Perhaps the true cost of freedom wasn't giving in to the forest pull. Perhaps it was resisting. Perhaps it was standing tall in the face of the darkness and refusing to let it consume him. But could he? Would he? The woman, his mother's shadow, let out a mocking laugh. "You cannot fight the inevitable. You can only delay it. But the forest always claims what it is owed." Joshua's gaze shifted to Linda. In that moment, he understood this wasn't just his fight. It was theirs. Together, they could fight it, or they could fall into the same abyss that had claimed so many before them. With newfound resolve, Joshua turned away from the woman and grabbed Linda's hand. "We're getting out of here," he said, his voice now firm. Together, the forest, it seemed, wasn't done with them, but neither were they. Joshua and Linda's retreat into the deeper woods was swift, fueled by an instinctual need to escape the looming presence of the dark force that had been watching them. The air was thick with the scent of pine, the ground beneath their feet soft with moss and rotting leaves. The forest, once a place of mystery and intrigue, now felt like a labyrinth, its trees closing in with every step they took. The oppressive silence weighed heavily on them, and every snap of a twig beneath their feet felt amplified, as though they were being followed, stalked by something just out of sight. Linda's hand trembled in Joshua's, her breath shallow as she tried to keep pace with him. "Where are we going?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant rustling of the trees. "We can't just run. We have to figure out how to stop this." Joshua's mind raced. His eyes darted between the shadows, half expecting to see the twisted figure of his mother, or worse, the monstrous form she had turned into, emerging from the depths. But the longer they ran, the more the forest seemed to envelop them. The trees didn't just loom. They shifted, almost as though they were watching and reacting to their every move. "I don't know," he replied, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. "I don't know how to stop this, but we can't stay there. We can't face it head on." Linda stopped abruptly, pulling Joshua to a halt with her. "What if that's exactly what we have to do?" Her eyes, filled with a mixture of defiance and desperation, met his. What if running only makes it worse? The idea hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. What if running wasn't the answer? What if, in this place, avoidance was the same as surrender? Joshua had seen it in the twisted figure of his mother, the way it had lured him with promises of escape, how it had drawn him in with its words. He could feel the pull of the forest in his bones, the magnetic draw of the keeper's power. It was as if the very soil beneath his feet was an extension of the malevolent force controlling everything around them. But Linda's words carried weight. She was right. Perhaps fleeing from the truth would only strengthen the forest's hold on them. Perhaps by running, they were merely prolonging the inevitable. The thought gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake it. The truth was, they were already caught in the web. There was no escaping it. To survive, to have any hope of breaking free, they would have to face it, confront the darkness head-on. "The Keeper's power isn't just here in the forest," Joshua murmured, more to himself than to Linda. "It's in everything. It's like it's in the very air we breathe." And that woman, my mother, she wasn't just a hallucination. She was part of it, part of them. Linda shuddered at the thought. "So, what do we do now?" How do we fight something like this? Joshua closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself, to push aside the swirling panic and fear. He knew that if they were to have any chance at all, they would need more than just willpower. They would need answers. They needed to understand the forest, the keeper, the entity that had brought them here and bound them to this cursed place. If they could find the source of its power, perhaps they could destroy it, or at the very least, find a way to break its hold. We need to find the heart of this place, he said, his voice firm, despite the rising tide of dread. That's where the keeper's power is strongest. If we can find that, maybe we can weaken it. Maybe we can force it to release us. Linda nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. The heart of the forest, she repeated. Do you know where it is? Joshua paused. He didn't know for sure. The truth was, he didn't even know if such a place existed. The forest was vast, its layout a twisted maze of trees and underbrush that seemed to change when they weren't looking. But there had been whispers, stories he'd heard over the years. His father had mentioned strange things about this place before his disappearance. How some believed the forest had a center, a place where the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest. It was said to be a place of power, a source that could bend reality itself. It was this place Joshua believed that the keeper drew its strength from. If they could find it, they could have a fighting chance. But how to find it? The forest didn't seem to make sense. It was as if it was alive, shifting and changing with every step they took. Every path they thought they had memorized led them in circles. Every time they thought they were heading in the right direction, the woods twisted around them, mocking their attempts to escape. As they moved deeper into the forest, the trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The air felt heavier, and the quiet was broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Joshua's thoughts churned, trying to form some sort of plan, some strategy. But the more he thought about the forest, the more he realized how little he understood about it. How could they fight something that had been part of the land for so long? How could they defeat an entity that had watched and waited for centuries? Suddenly, a sound broke through the oppressive silence, a soft, distant hum, almost imperceptible at first. It was a low, mournful sound, like the call of something ancient, something far older than the trees themselves. The sound seemed to echo through the woods, reverberating deep into Joshua's bones. Linda's hand tightened around his arm. What is that? Joshua's heart raced. He knew the sound. It was the same hum he had heard earlier, back at the festival. The sound that had triggered the vision of his mother. The hum that seemed to draw him in, like a siren's call. It was the sound of the forest waking, of the keeper's power stirring. I don't know, he replied, his voice tight. But I think it's coming from... there? He pointed to a clearing up ahead, barely visible through the dense trees. The hum seemed to be coming from that direction, stronger now like a heartbeat in the distance. They didn't speak as they moved toward the sound. Each step felt like they were moving closer to something inevitable, something they couldn't escape. The closer they got, the more the forest seemed to bend and warp around them. The trees shifted, their branches contorting into shapes that looked almost human, almost aware. The air grew colder, and Joshua's breath began to fog in front of him. As they reached the edge of the clearing, they both stopped. Before them lay a stone circle, ancient and weathered, its edges covered in moss and vines. At the center of the circle was a large, black stone, smooth and polished, radiating an unnatural cold. The hum was louder now, emanating from the stone itself, as if it were alive. Joshua felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. This was it, the heart of the forest, the source of the keeper's power, and they were standing right in its shadow. The stone circle loomed before Joshua and Linda, its presence both ancient and suffocating. The air around it was thick with a power they could almost taste, a dark and oppressive force that seemed to press in on them from all sides. As they stood at the edge of the clearing, the hum of the stone grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet and echoing in their ears like a warning. Every instinct within Joshua screamed to turn back, to flee into the woods, to leave this place behind before it consumed them. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far. and the force that had been pulling them here was too strong. Linda's breath came in shallow gasps beside him, and Joshua could feel her hand trembling in his. This is it, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "This is the heart of it all." Joshua nodded, his throat tight. "This is where it all started. This is where the Keeper's power is at its strongest." The stone in the center of the circle was black, polished to a smooth sheen. But there was something unnatural about it. It seemed to shimmer with an eerie light, as though it were alive, pulsing with an energy that neither of them could fully comprehend. It was cold, unnervingly cold, and as they stepped closer, they could feel the temperature drop, the chill seeping into their bones. "What do we do now?" Linda asked, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and uncertainty. "How do we stop this? How do we destroy it?" Joshua's mind raced. He had no clear answer, no real plan. He had hoped that once they reached the heart of the forest, everything would become clear, that some part of him would know what to do. But standing here now, with the weight of the Keeper's presence pressing in on them, he realized how little he actually knew. He had no clue how to destroy this thing, how to break its hold on him, on the land, on his mother. He had always thought that the forest was a place of mystery, a place that held secrets. But now he saw it differently. The forest was alive, yes, but not in the way he had imagined. It wasn't a living thing of beauty or growth. It was a force of pure will, a presence that had been here long before him, long before anyone. It had existed in the dark places of the world, waiting, watching, feeding off the fear of those who stumbled too close. The Keeper wasn't just a creature, it was an embodiment of that fear, an extension of the forest itself. But Joshua wasn't afraid anymore. The fear that had gripped him since the moment he first heard the hum had begun to fade. It had been replaced by something else, a kind of cold, detached understanding. The Keeper was powerful, yes, but it was not invincible. It fed off fear, off the weakness of those who encountered it. And as long as Joshua was afraid, he could never hope to defeat it. Linda looked at him, her eyes wide with the same uncertainty that Joshua had been feeling moments before. "What do we do, Joshua?" she asked again, her voice quiet, almost pleading. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the stone, and he felt something stir inside him, something deep and primal. It wasn't just the hum that had drawn him here. It was something more, something darker, that had been with him all along, buried deep in his mind. He had felt it in his mother, in the twisted versions of his family that had been warped by the forest's influence. It was a kind of compulsion, a dark pull that he couldn't explain, but he could feel it now more strongly than ever. He was meant to be here. He could feel the Keeper's power calling to him, beckoning him closer, promising answers, promising release from the fear that had held him captive for so long. But there was something else too, something buried deep beneath the stone, hidden from sight, a truth that had been obscured by the forest's manipulation. Taking a deep breath, Joshua moved forward, stepping into the stone circle. He felt the ground beneath his feet shift, the earth seeming to twist and ripple with each step he took. It was as if the forest itself was responding to his presence, acknowledging him, sensing his intention. The hum grew louder, vibrating through his entire body, but Joshua ignored it. He had to focus. Linda hesitated, her eyes locked on him, but Joshua didn't look back. He couldn't. There was something in the center of the stone circle, something that had been waiting for him, something that held the answers. As he reached the stone, he placed his hand on its cold surface. The moment his skin made contact with it, a jolt of energy shot through him, sharp and electric. His vision blurred for a moment, and he staggered back, struggling to remain on his feet. The hum grew deafening, and he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. But through the dizziness, he saw it. The stone was not a stone at all. It was a mirror, a reflection of something much darker, something ancient. In its surface, Joshua saw images, flickering, distorted visions of his past, of his family, of the life he had once known. His mother's face, her twisted, inhuman form, staring at him with eyes that seemed to pierce his very soul. He saw the festival, the crowds, the music, the laughter, all of it fading into the shadows of something far more terrifying. But there was more. Beneath the surface of the stone, beneath the visions of his past, there was a deeper truth. It wasn't just his life that had been affected by the forest. It was everyone's. The Keeper had been using him, using his family, to feed its power, to feed the forest itself. The forest was alive, not because it was natural, but because it had been nurtured by something darker, something that thrived on the fear of those who came too close. The realization hit Joshua like a tidal wave, and he stumbled back, breaking contact with the stone. The world around him seemed to lurch and twist, as if reality itself was bending. He could hear Linda's voice, distant and faint, but it was drowned out by the sound of the hum, now a deafening roar in his ears. The Keeper had been using him all along. It had been waiting for him to uncover the truth, for him to come to this moment. But Joshua wasn't the victim in this story. He was the key. He looked at Linda, his face pale, and for the first time, he truly understood. It wasn't just the forest they were up against. It was the very fabric of reality, the twisted, corrupted force that had been manipulating them from the very beginning. And now that they had uncovered it, now that they had come so close, there was no going back. The only question that remained was whether they could fight it, whether they could break the chain before it consumed them entirely. As Joshua stood at the center of the stone circle, a horrifying clarity washed over him. His hands still tingled with the coldness of the stone, and his mind buzzed with fragments of understanding, pieces of the larger, incomprehensible puzzle that the forest had been crafting for centuries. The Keeper's influence was not limited to his family or the land. It reached deeper than that. It had woven itself into the very fabric of human existence, feeding on the fear of generations, manipulating time itself, and casting shadows where none should have been. Linda was beside him, her face a pale mirror of his own confusion, but something in her eyes had changed. The moment Joshua made contact with the stone, it was as if she had understood too. She could feel it, the same unsettling knowledge creeping up her spine, making her heart race with dread. The hum of the stone seemed to reverberate inside her, just as it had in him, but she could not comprehend what it meant. What it all meant. She stepped closer, reaching for him, her voice barely a whisper. "Joshua, what is happening? What did you see?" Joshua's throat was tight, his voice thick with the realization that his fate was already entwined with the forest's dark legacy. "It's not just the forest, Linda. It's everything. The Keeper, it's been guiding us all along, shaping us, manipulating our lives." His words felt empty even as he spoke them, hollow, as though the weight of their meaning was too much to bear. They both knew, deep down, that nothing they had experienced was a coincidence. From the moment they set foot on the festival grounds, they had been part of the Keeper's grand design, a design that stretched back beyond history, beyond memory, into the primal origins of the land itself. The festival, the music, the crowds, all of it had been a trap. And now, standing in the heart of the forest, they were faced with the full extent of that trap. Joshua felt his knees grow weak beneath him. The stone in the circle pulsed with a force he could not explain, its energy feeding into him, drawing something from deep within. The hum had turned into a low, resonating thrum that vibrated through his chest and rattled his bones. His thoughts scattered as the whispers began, creeping into the periphery of his mind. At first, they were barely audible, like the fluttering of wings in the distance. But then the voices grew louder, clearer, until they drowned out everything else. Joshua, you are the one." The words were not spoken aloud, but rather were felt deep inside his mind, as though they had always been there, waiting for him to unlock them. The Keeper's voice, or something that masqueraded as it, flowed through him, speaking not with malice, but with an ancient sense of inevitability. Joshua's pulse quickened, and his breathing became erratic. I can't hear it," he said, his voice trembling. "It's in my head. The Keeper is speaking to me." Linda's grip on his arm tightened, but Joshua hardly noticed. His gaze remained fixed on the stone, now glowing faintly in the moonlight, its surface rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. The keeper's whispers filled his ears, each word growing clearer, more insistent. "You are the key," the voice continued, slithering like an oil slick through his thoughts. "You are the vessel, the final piece. You will carry the power of the forest, and in turn, you will carry the burden of the world." Joshua's stomach churned. The stone was calling him, drawing him closer, urging him to accept its power. It wasn't just his bloodline, his family, that the keeper wanted to control. It was all of humanity. The forest had been lying in wait for someone like Joshua, a conduit to bring the Earth's ancient, primal force into the modern world. The keeper needed him to complete its plan. Joshua's mind screamed in defiance, but his body refused to listen. The pull was irresistible. He could feel the darkness inside him, an abyss that had always been there, and it wanted to consume everything. He could feel it pushing against his chest, an overwhelming force that threatened to tear him apart. He could see it now, the keeper's true form, not a monster or a creature, but something far worse. It was a distortion of reality itself, a being whose existence was rooted in the manipulation of time, of space, of fear. The voice in his mind was deafening now, a constant torrent of demands and promises. "Embrace it, Joshua. Embrace what you were meant to be. You are the keeper of the forest now. You will command the shadows and the light, bending them to your will." Linda screamed his name, shaking him violently. But it was too late. Joshua's eyes had glazed over, the light in them fading as the forest's power began to seep into him fully. His body no longer felt like his own. It was as though he were becoming part of the stone, part of the land itself. His thoughts grew distant, replaced by the dark whispers that promised power, eternal life, and dominion over all that lived. Linda took a step back, her mind racing. She had to do something, but what? Joshua was slipping away from her, becoming something unrecognizable, something twisted by the forest's grip. She had read about possession, about dark forces that took hold of those too weak to resist. But this was different. This wasn't just possession. This was an awakening. The keeper wasn't taking Joshua. It was making him its heir, its master. She had to stop him before it was too late. Her fingers fumbled around her neck, where she had once worn the small pendant her grandmother had given her. It was a simple silver locket, nothing remarkable about it, except for the faint symbol etched into the metal. It had always been a comfort, a talisman passed down through generations. Now, it felt like the only thing that could save them. If there was any hope, it lay in the power of that symbol. With trembling hands, Linda opened the locket and held it before Joshua's face, desperately praying for some sign of recognition, some way to break the hold the keeper had over him. As the pendant swung back and forth, a soft glow began to radiate from it, its light growing brighter with each passing moment. Joshua's expression flickered, just for a moment, and then the whispers in his mind faltered. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him of who he was. Linda's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea how much time they had, but she knew this was their last chance. The force was trying to take him. She couldn't let it. As the pendant's light spread through the air, there was a brief moment of stillness, as if time itself had paused to watch what would happen next. Joshua's vacant expression flickered, his pupils narrowing as they locked onto the pendant. For the first time since the stone circle had engulfed him, there was a glimmer of recognition, something human, something real. Linda held her breath, the weight of her desperate hope crashing down on her. She knew that this was their only chance. In that fleeting moment, the world seemed to contract, and the forest, once alive with sounds of unseen creatures, fell silent. The thrum of the stone circle, the hum that had been reverberating within Joshua, quieted. A strange calm filled the space, and Linda dared to believe, even if only for a second, that Joshua could still be saved. But that brief flicker of hope quickly dissolved as the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. It wasn't just the earth quaking. It was as though the fabric of reality itself was splitting. Joshua's eyes widened, no longer filled with the vacancy of the keeper's influence, but with something far darker, fear. The pendant, once a beacon of hope, now seemed to pulse with its own ominous rhythm, almost as if it were rejecting the very power it had once harbored. Linda's heart raced as she held it out further, but the glow flickered, and the stone circle before them began to shift. The edges of the circle blurred, bending like smoke in the wind. The earth cracked open, and the familiar night sky began to warp, twisting into impossible shapes, breaking apart like shards of glass. Joshua stumbled back, clutching his head, as if fighting against an invisible force pulling him deeper into the abyss. Linda stepped forward, but before she could reach him, she heard it. Another voice, not the keeper's, but something far older, something primal. It echoed in her mind, reverberating with the power of an ancient curse. "Leave him, or we'll take you too." The words sent a chill down her spine, and she faltered. The ground beneath her feet began to dissolve, as if the very foundation of the world was crumbling away. She reached for Joshua again, but his form flickered, shifting in and out of focus. His body was no longer entirely corporeal, as though he was being pulled between worlds. "What's happening?" Linda screamed, her voice raw with panic. She had to act quickly. The keeper's power and the power of the forest were not bound by the rules of normal time. The longer they remained in the stone circle, the further they drifted from the world they knew. Joshua was slipping into a rift, one that threatened to tear apart not just him, but everything in its path. Joshua's voice, now faint and broken, echoed from the void between realms. "I'm sorry, Linda. I'm sorry." His words were like a distant cry, barely audible above the swirling chaos around them. His image flickered again, and Linda saw it, a dark, shadowy figure standing behind him, a manifestation of the keeper itself. It loomed over Joshua, feeding on his fear, drawing him further into the rift that had opened in the fabric of time. Linda's mind raced. She needed to pull him back before the rift closed for good and swallowed him whole. She thought of the pendant again, its glow weakening, but still holding some vestige of power. Could it be the key to closing the rift? The forest had been manipulating time itself. Maybe the pendant, tied to her family's legacy, had a power she had not fully understood until now. She closed her eyes and focused, reaching deep within herself, trying to call on whatever strength lay dormant inside her. The pendant, in her grip, began to hum again, its glow flaring in bursts. She could feel the pull, the undeniable force trying to drag her away, but she held fast. Her fingers tightened around the pendant's chain as she whispered the words her grandmother had once told her, words that had seemed like simple lore until now. "Through time's rift, beyond the veil, let this light remain whole." For a moment, nothing happened, but then the air shifted. The ground stopped shaking. The strange rift in time began to slow, and Joshua's form solidified once more. His eyes were wide, filled with panic, but also a flicker of something more, recognition. The keeper's influence began to recede, but it wasn't gone. It lingered, like a shadow refusing to leave the light. Joshua collapsed to his knees, gasping for air as though he had been drowning. Linda dropped to the ground beside him, her fingers still clutching the pendant. She didn't know if it was the words, the pendant, or sheer willpower that had closed the rift, but it didn't matter. They had made it through barely. As Joshua regained his composure, he looked up at Linda, his face pale but no longer distant. "Linda, what just happened?" His voice was hoarse, as though he had been shouting for hours. Linda didn't have an answer. What had just happened wasn't just a battle for Joshua's soul. It was a battle against the very nature of reality itself. They had touched something beyond the comprehension of mere humans, something that had been waiting for millennia to break free. The Keeper was not just a force of the forest. It was a force of time, a being older than the stars, seeking to warp everything in its image. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But whatever it was, it's not over." She didn't need to explain further. Joshua could feel it too. The darkness still clung to the edges of their minds, like an unfinished symphony playing in the background of their thoughts. The Keeper had not been vanquished. It was only biding its time, waiting for its next move. The rift had been closed for now, but the war had only just begun. In the aftermath of the rift's closing, Linda and Joshua sat in an uneasy silence. The forest around them, once a vibrant celebration of life, now felt like a haunting landscape, a strange, shifting dream. The pendant, still warm in Linda's hand, seemed to pulse with an energy that neither of them fully understood. It had done something, yes, but it hadn't solved everything. The shadows from the rift lingered, moving like a slow tide beneath their feet. Joshua's voice broke the silence, his words heavy with the weight of the moment. I thought I was lost," he murmured, his gaze distant as he looked at the swirling air where the rift had once been. "The Keeper, it felt like I was drowning in it. Like something was pulling me into a place I didn't want to go." Linda's heart tightened. She had seen the transformation in Joshua, from the bright, humorous soul she had known, to the hollow, controlled version that had been a puppet of the Keeper. She had fought for him, for his humanity. But now, with the rift seemingly sealed, she wondered if they had truly escaped or if they were simply postponing the inevitable. "We're not safe yet," she said, her voice sharp and certain, trying to pull her thoughts together. "Whatever happened tonight, it wasn't the end. The Keeper has too much power. It's not done with us. Not by a long shot." Joshua nodded, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I know, but if it's not over, then what are we supposed to do? How do we fight something like that?" Linda looked down at the pendant, which had quieted but still seemed to thrum with energy. It was more than a simple object. It was a bridge, a tool that had been passed down through generations in her family. It held secrets she had yet to uncover. And while it had been a lifeline, a tether that pulled Joshua back from the abyss, Linda knew it wasn't enough. She could feel it in her bones. "We need to understand this," Linda said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her clothes. "We need to know what the pendant truly is, what the Keeper really wants. We're playing a game we don't understand, and until we figure out the rules, we're at its mercy." Joshua stood with her, but his gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the flickering lights of the music festival could still be seen. The sounds of the crowd, laughter, cheers, the soft strum of guitars, felt oddly distant now, as if a veil had descended between them and the world they once knew. It was like they were standing on the edge of two realities. One was familiar, full of warmth and joy, but the other, this strange, haunting existence, had seeped into their lives, reshaping everything. "We can't go back," Joshua said quietly. "Not after what happened. If we go back to the festival, if we try to pretend everything's fine, it'll just be like we're walking right into the Keeper's trap." Linda's stomach churned at the thought. They had come to the festival seeking solace, hoping to escape the stress of their lives with music and carefree moments. Now it seemed that the festival was the very place where everything had started to unravel, where the forces of darkness had been waiting all along. The Keeper had chosen them for a reason, and whatever that reason was, they weren't going to find answers by hiding from it. "We'll go back," Linda said with a resolve she hadn't felt before. "But we won't pretend. We'll face whatever comes next. But first, we need to find the truth." Joshua met her gaze, his eyes still filled with uncertainty. "But how do we even begin? We don't know where to start." Linda took a deep breath. She knew he was right. This wasn't a battle they could win without knowing their enemy. "We start with what we do know," she said, thinking aloud. "The pendant, the Keeper, the rift. There has to be something that connects them. Something from the past, something about this forest, this place. My family must know more. There's a reason I've been brought into this." They both turned towards the distant lights, where the festival continued unabated, unaware of the dark forces at play in the shadows. The music, the laughter, the celebrations. They all felt like a distant memory now, as though the world had shifted around them and left them stranded in a place where none of it mattered anymore. The Keeper was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next move. And Linda knew that they had no choice but to play its game, to risk everything for the answers that could save them. If they didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to save. The storm was coming, an ancient, primal force, and it was only a matter of time before it arrived at their door. The festival, with its neon lights and the soft country tunes drifting from the stages, now felt like a facade, a thin veil over something much darker. Linda and Joshua walked side by side, the weight of their shared understanding pressing down on them with every step. The crowd, oblivious to the storm that had begun to stir beneath the surface, moved in rhythm with the music, swaying and laughing as if nothing had changed. But for Linda and Joshua, everything had changed. The air was thick with the scent of something old and forgotten, something that didn't belong. They found themselves standing at the edge of the festival grounds, away from the main stage where the performers continued to play their upbeat tunes. The laughter and chatter of festival-goers faded as they stepped into a quieter area, an old, half-forgotten part of the site where weathered barns and rundown stalls stood like ghosts of the past. It was here Linda knew that the key to everything lay. The festival's true history was buried in these remnants, hidden from the eyes of those who thought this celebration was nothing more than a collection of songs and drinks. "Something about this place doesn't sit right," Joshua muttered, his eyes scanning the area. His tone was apprehensive, the wariness of someone who knows they're being watched but can't see the watcher. Linda nodded in agreement, her senses heightened. She could feel it, the heavy silence of forgotten memories that seemed to linger in the air, like whispers in the wind. Linda's family had always been tied to the land in one way or another. Her grandmother had often spoken of the old ways, of rituals passed down through generations. But it wasn't until now, until she had seen the power of the pendant and felt the rift tear through reality, that Linda began to truly understand the depth of that legacy. This festival, this very location, wasn't just a random site for music and fun. It was a place steeped in something older, something darker. As they approached a dilapidated barn on the edge of the grounds, Linda felt a pull in her chest, an inexplicable connection to the building. There was something here, something she needed to uncover. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice in her head, warning her not to go looking for trouble, but Linda had no choice. The truth was here, and it was calling to her. "Do you feel that?" Linda asked, her voice low. Joshua nodded, his expression clouded with confusion. "Yeah, it's like something's trying to keep us from going inside." Linda's heart raced. The closer they got, the stronger the sensation became, as if the barn itself were resisting their presence. But she couldn't turn back now. They had come this far, and they had no other choice but to push forward. With a deep breath, Linda stepped inside, the creaky door protesting as it swung open. The inside of the barn was dark, the only light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. The floor was covered in dust, and the air smelled of mildew and decay. It was an eerie, oppressive space, but it was also filled with remnants of something more. A strange symbol was carved into one of the wooden beams, its sharp lines and curves unfamiliar, yet unsettlingly familiar. Linda's fingers brushed against the symbol, and she felt a jolt of energy shoot through her, like a shock to her very bones. "What is that?" Joshua whispered, stepping closer. Linda didn't answer immediately. She was focused, her mind racing as she tried to place the symbol. It wasn't just some random design. It was a sigil, one that had been passed down through her family's bloodline. One her grandmother had shown her in old books she had thought were simply myths. But this was no myth. This was a symbol of protection, a warding ritual that had been used to keep something powerful at bay. "This is it," Linda said softly, more to herself than to Joshua. "This is what the keeper was after. This is why it's here." Joshua's gaze shifted nervously around the barn. "Why here? Why in the middle of the festival?" Linda looked around, finally understanding. The barn wasn't just a place of storage or the remnants of past events. It was a gate, a point of convergence between worlds. The festival grounds had been built on top of ancient sites, places where rituals were once held to keep dark forces from crossing over. The Keeper, with its power to manipulate time and space, had been trying to break through the boundaries set by those who came before them. And now, with Linda and Joshua standing on the edge of this forgotten history, they were closer than ever to uncovering the full extent of what had been hidden. She could feel the pull of the pendant again, the way it seemed to resonate with the sigil carved into the barn. It was like a call to the past, drawing her closer to something ancient, something that had been waiting to be uncovered. "The pendant," Linda said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's tied to this place. It's not just an object, it's a key. Joshua's face softened, a flicker of understanding passing through his eyes. A key to what? Linda didn't have an answer, not yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The Keeper had been manipulating time and reality to get to this point. It had been using them as pawns, pushing them toward this barn, to this very sigil. And now, the pieces were falling into place. The rift, the pendant, the Keeper. It was all part of a much larger, much more terrifying plan. Whatever happens next, Joshua, we need to be ready, Linda said, her voice steady but filled with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everything. The festival, this whole town, it's all part of something much bigger. And we're going to stop it, no matter what it takes. The sense of urgency pressing on Linda and Joshua intensified as the realization set in. The pendant, the sigil, the forgotten history. They were not mere relics of the past, but active forces waiting to converge. The barn, once just an oddity on the outskirts of the festival, had revealed itself as the epicenter of something ancient, something powerful. Linda's fingers traced the edges of the symbol carved into the beam, and for the first time, she understood the weight of what had been placed in her hands. The pendant wasn't just a key to unlock hidden doors, it was a lifeline. The question now wasn't what the pendant could unlock, but whether it could keep the Keeper contained. They both stood in the dim light, their breath shallow, as the echo of the festival's distant music was a stark contrast to the quiet terror that had settled over the barn. The walls felt oppressive, as though the air itself was thickening with the presence of something that should not be. The Keeper, that shadowed figure they had heard of only in whispers, was no longer an unseen force. It was here, pressing against the thin veil of reality that surrounded them. It had used them as pawns, had drawn them into its game with the cunning of a master manipulator. But the truth was that they were not simply trapped in a game. They were facing something far more terrifying. The Keeper had been playing for far longer than they had been aware. Joshua looked at Linda, his face etched with the strain of everything they had witnessed. How do we stop it, Linda? His voice was raw, the edges frayed with fear. The steady rhythm of the music outside the barn seemed to mock them, a sharp contrast to the chaos they felt deep within their bones. How do we even fight something like that? Linda felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had no answer, not one that made sense in the context of the world they knew. But she knew that the Keeper was not bound by the laws of the living. It could slip through cracks in time, could reach into the very fabric of reality and twist it to its will. And now it had no need for subtlety. The Keeper was coming for them. The fact that they were still alive meant little in the grand scheme of things. The rift had been but a taste of what was to come. We need to uncover everything about the Keeper, Linda said, her voice quiet but firm. There's a reason it's been tied to this place. And there's a reason we've been chosen. We have to understand what we're dealing with. Joshua nodded, the weariness in his eyes giving way to determination. But how do we even start? What if we don't have the time? What if it's already here? Linda's eyes flicked back to the sigil, feeling an odd warmth pulse through the pendant in her hand as though it, too, was beginning to wake. The symbol was a map, a guide, a roadmap to something deeper, something the Keeper needed. But what was that something? Why had it used the rift to draw them into its world? Why had it been so desperate to manipulate time, to tear apart the fabric of reality? The barn, with its rotting beams and cracked foundation, seemed to shift around them. The air thickened, pressing in from all sides, and Linda could swear she felt something brush past her, something unseen and cold. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The Keeper had been silent for too long, but it was never far away. It had been drawing them in, manipulating them from the shadows, and now it was ready to make its move. Linda, Joshua's voice broke through her thoughts, shaky with fear. Did you feel that? It's here. It's really here. Linda took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. The pendant grew warmer in her hand, the faint glow from the sigil seeming to respond to her rising anxiety. The air was growing heavier with each passing second, the space between them and the rest of the world narrowing. The barn had ceased to be just a physical structure. It had become something else entirely, a conduit, a bridge between worlds. And at its heart, the Keeper was waiting. "We can't run from this, Joshua," Linda said, her voice barely a whisper as she turned to face him. "This has been building for generations. This place, this festival, it's all been a part of it. The Keeper, it's been here before. It's older than we know. And if we don't stop it now, if we don't figure out how to destroy it, everything will change." Joshua's face turned pale. "Destroy it? How do we even begin to destroy something like that?" Linda swallowed, her throat dry. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I have to believe there's a way. I have to believe that the pendant, the sigil, the rituals, they were put here for a reason. We're not just here by accident." As she spoke, the barn seemed to groan, as though it were waking up. A low hum filled the space, and the floor beneath them vibrated with the strength of some unseen force. The walls seemed to shift, the shadows stretching unnaturally as the temperature dropped, and Linda's breath came out in a visible puff of air. The Keeper was pushing against the barriers of reality, testing its limits. It wanted more, and it wasn't going to wait much longer. "I know what we need to do," Linda said, her voice resolute. She took a step back towards the edge of the barn. "We need to go deeper, into the heart of this place. The Keeper doesn't just want to break through to this world. It wants to rewrite it, to bend it to its will. The pendant, the sigil, they're part of something bigger. We need to find the source, the heart of it, before the Keeper does." Joshua hesitated, his eyes darting around the barn as though expecting something to jump out of the shadows at any moment. "But how do we even know where to look?" Linda took another deep breath, steadying herself. "The sigil, it's a map to the Keeper's power. We need to trace it, understand where it leads. But we're not just facing a force of nature. This is something intelligent, something that's been watching us. We can't underestimate it." Joshua's eyes met hers, a mixture of fear and determination flashing across his face. "So we go in, we find its heart, we destroy it." Linda nodded, though inside she wasn't so sure. But one thing had become crystal clear. The Keeper would not stop until it had everything it needed. And they were the only ones who stood between it and total destruction. The barn was only the beginning, and if they didn't act quickly, they would be swallowed whole by whatever darkness lay ahead. As the last hours of the country music festival approached, Linda and Joshua found themselves standing at the precipice of something unimaginable. The barn, now fully revealed as the epicenter of the dark forces at play, seemed to pulse with a rhythmic thrum, as if it were alive. The festival, with its bright lights and sounds, continued unaware of the ancient battle unfolding just beyond the boundaries of the crowd. But for Linda and Joshua, there was no going back. The Keeper, whose shadow had hung over them for so long, was ready to make its final move. And they had no choice but to face it head-on. Linda held the pendant tightly in her hand, the sigil still faintly glowing as if resonating with the very air around them. Its warmth was both a comfort and a burden. She had no illusions that the pendant was a simple solution. It was merely a part of the puzzle. The Keeper, after all, had been manipulating events for centuries. It wasn't going to be vanquished by a single relic. The deeper she and Joshua had gone, the more they realized that the Keeper's influence was not just tied to the barn or the pendant. It was woven into the fabric of the festival, a place where time and memory blurred, where the past and present collided in ways that were both subtle and terrifying. As they stood together, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressed heavily on them. The Keeper had been using the festival as a way to anchor itself to the world, to grow stronger. The performers, the dancers, the tourists who had come seeking joy and excitement, they had all unknowingly played a role in the Keeper's scheme. It had manipulated the very essence of the festival, feeding off the energy of the crowd, weaving its tendrils through their memories and emotions, preparing to strike when the time was right. And now, the time had come. "We have to break the connection," Linda said, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "The pendant is part of it, but it's not the whole solution. We need to sever the Keeper's hold on this place." Joshua nodded, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with the weight of everything they had seen. He could feel the tension, the electric charge in the air, as though something were about to snap. But how? How do we even begin to sever it? Linda's gaze was fixed on the barn's rotting beams, her mind racing. She had pieced together the clues over the course of the festival, the subtle hints that had led them to this moment. The sigil, the rift, the forgotten rituals, it was all connected. The Keeper had not simply been waiting for a time to strike. It had been waiting for the convergence, the moment when the forces of past and present would collide. The music, the memories, the people, they were all part of the ritual. And now that the festival was reaching its peak, the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. The Keeper is tied to the collective energy of the festival, Linda said slowly, her voice gaining strength as the pieces clicked into place. The memories of everyone who has come here, the emotions, the connections they've formed, everything feeds into it. It's been feeding off the joy, the sorrow, the excitement. The music has been its conduit, and now it wants to open a door to break free of this place. Joshua's eyes widened in realization. So, if we can sever the link to the festival, break its hold on the people, we can stop it? Linda nodded. Exactly. But we can't just destroy it physically. We need to sever the emotional and temporal ties it has to this place. We need to reverse the ritual it's been performing, break the cycle. Joshua looked out at the distant festival grounds, where the stage lights blinked in time with the pulsing rhythm of the night. The music played on, the crowd oblivious to the ancient evil that was about to be unleashed. It was then that Joshua realized that this wasn't just about stopping the Keeper. It was about saving everyone. Every person who had come to the festival, every musician, every dancer, they were all in danger. And in this moment, it was up to them to protect them. Linda turned to him. We need to go to the heart of the festival, the stage. We need to confront the Keeper where it's strongest, where its influence is most concentrated. Joshua didn't hesitate. They both knew that this was their final chance, that there would be no other opportunity. They raced through the darkness of the barn, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, their hearts pounding in unison. As they emerged into the open, the festival stretched out before them, vibrant and alive, the music and laughter of the crowd filling the air. But there was an underlying tension now, a feeling of impending doom that only they seemed to sense. As they approached the stage, the crowd swirled around them, unaware of the danger that loomed just beyond their perception. The Keeper had woven itself into the very fabric of the festival, using the music to amplify its power. But as Linda and Joshua reached the stage, something shifted. The air grew thick, the sound of the music warping, distorting. The Keeper's presence grew stronger, a cold, oppressive weight pressing down on them. "This is it," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of the festival. "We're at the heart of it now." Joshua nodded, his hand tightening on the pendant. "Let's end this." They stepped forward, the pendant glowing brighter now, casting a flickering light on the stage. The Keeper's influence rippled outward, a tangible force pushing back against them. It was here that the two worlds collided, the world of the living, vibrant and full of life, and the world of the Keeper, dark and cold, a place where time held no meaning. With a sudden, violent surge, the Keeper manifested before them, its form an ever-shifting shadow, its eyes gleaming with an otherworldly hunger. The music swelled, the crowd screaming in unison as the fabric of reality began to tear. But Linda and Joshua stood their ground. They had come too far to turn back now. Linda raised the pendant high, the sigil glowing with an intense light that seemed to cut through the darkness. "This ends now," she said, her voice ringing with finality. The light from the pendant blazed brighter than ever, a beacon in the night. The Keeper recoiled, its form flickering, struggling against the light. And then, with a final, deafening roar, the Keeper was gone. The darkness that had gripped the festival dissolved into nothingness, and the music faltered, fading into silence. In that moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. The crowd, still unaware of what had just transpired, stood frozen, as if the very air had changed. The energy of the festival had shifted, no longer feeding the dark force that had nearly consumed them all. And as Linda and Joshua stood amidst the stillness, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, signaling the end of the festival and the end of the Keeper's reign. For Linda and Joshua, the journey had been long and fraught with peril, but it was over now. The Keeper had been stopped, its grip on the world broken. And as they turned to leave, knowing that the world would never be the same, they felt a strange sense of peace. The festival would go on, its music once again a source of joy, not fear. But they would always remember that night, the night when they faced the darkness and won.